So I would like to tell a story today. Can everybody see okay? Is that showing up okay? Great.
Yes, it's okay.
Great. So I would like to tell a little bit of a story today. A bit of it is about the human experience, and a bit of it is about the idea of programming. And we'll take this in a lot of fun directions, and I hope you enjoy it. This talk is called The Loop. And the beginning of this talk happens with a company. This is my company. We do professional trainings. We do video courses. And a map. And this particular map starts in the middle of the United States, in the middle of the eastern part of the United States, in a town called Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it is a journey, some people say a little bit of a pilgrimage that people take in boats. Now, it's not something that either myself or my wife would ever consider doing in most cases. But I want to talk about how this particular idea started. This is where we were in about 2020, 2021, which most of you remember as a pretty bad year, not just for Chattanooga, but for the world. We had COVID, and COVID-19 was something that I firmly believed would kill me. If you look at these risk factors, this is an up-to-date mortality chart. But at the time, we thought that if you had one or more of these conditions, you were at high risk of perishing of this disease. So I was afraid, and I was increasingly ensnared in a deep depression over this disease. So normally when I have these depressed feelings, I have a ray of light, and that's my wife, Maggie. But it turns out she was depressed too. And we didn't know our way out. The normal things that we would look to seemed to be going poorly. My job, my relationships, we were in isolation, and we were pretty sad. And I'll remember where I was till the day that I die when I saw my wife reading this book. It's called From What Is to What If. And it's about reimagining where you are. And instead of looking at where you're coming from, this book is about imagining where you would like to be and taking tangible steps to go there. You see, we were in this place in our home. Maybe you could look at it in the shape of a coffin if you're in the midst of a depression. Or maybe you could reimagine what a quarantine might look like. Maybe you could say, instead of being in a quarantine in this big house, let's reimagine our quarantine in a floating house and take this pilgrimage called the Great Loop. Think about it for a while. This is Maggie that we're talking about, and some of you know her. Actually, more and more of you are knowing her. She is not a risk taker. She is a person that is born with hospitality, and she's not one for adventure at all. But I come downstairs maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks after reading this Great Loop experience, or after reading From What Is to What If, and she is reading this book called From What Is to What If. And after that, she's reading the Great Loop experience, and I saw that book and I knew what it meant, and I almost fell down the stairs, right? So I looked at her, and she looked at me with a shy little smile and said, I guess we're doing this, right? It's just like that. Our circumstances changed because we were going to take this trip. We're going to start in Chattanooga, Tennessee, climb in a boat, and you gotta understand, we are not boat people. We had a little boat for a little while, and we were going to trade that in for a much larger boat, though still a very small boat by Great Loop standards. We were going to trade in this boat that was meant for taking small day trips, and we were going to trade it in for a boat that could go long distances. And we were going to go from Chattanooga, we were going to follow that V river that you see in front of you, the Tennessee River. Going to follow that out to a waterway that's a canal called the Ten-Ton Waterway. Going to take that all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And that's probably about twice the height, maybe 2 or 3 times the height of Kenya itself. And then we were going to follow this to the edge of civilization in Florida. And then we were going to zip across into the open ocean. For a short amount of time, we would not be able to see land. We would spend all night long in the boat, probably all by ourselves, because the season when we would take this trip. We would go around the tip of Florida. We would go all the way up the seaboard. We would visit our friend, Frank Hunleth, while we were there. We would go into the harbor for New York, hopefully see the Statue of Liberty. We would go up into Canada, across Canada, and all these small little canals that cut across the country. And then we would head to Chicago through Lake Michigan, down the Illinois River, down the Mississippi River, and then we would head home. And the Great Loop. So my wife and I said, let's get a boat. Let's take the dog. Let's take the boat, and we'll do this Great Loop thing. Now, you've got to understand that if you don't know anything about boats, buying a boat can be this ridiculous experience. And it turns out that during the time of COVID, there was a lot of money flying around in the United States, probably too much money flying around in the United States. And a lot of people were reimagining their circumstances, and they were buying boats too. And it turns out by the time that we decided to look at a boat, the boat was gone. But we found this particular boat, and before even seeing it, we said, we'll put this small deposit on it, we'll look it over, and if we like it, this is the one that we'd like to buy. Now, this next picture is a little bit striking because this is how we met currently the very first time. Currently was the name of our boat because we were river people and rivers had current. And currently was the way that we wanted to view life. We wanted to see life as one particular small snapshot in time. So we drove across country. We drove through Mississippi and Alabama, through Georgia, and then into Florida. And then we found ourselves in this mall parking lot. In a mall parking lot. And we thought that we would see our boat in the water. It wasn't that way. So we saw this boat. We did a little bit of work on the boat that we could, the small things that we knew how to do, but mostly it was in good shape. And then they picked up this boat with a forklift. That's the truck with long arms, and it picked the boat up. And they drove the boat through a parking lot, through all these trucks and small cars, and it's weaving around. The forklift is weaving around, and the boat is rocking around, and we just knew they were going to drop it. And I wanted to shout, but all the workers were looking around bored. And then they put the boat on the trailer, and we got on a plane to go home, and the boat came about 24 hours later, maybe a little bit longer than that. And then they lowered it into the water. So if you look at this picture, there's a dock sticking out behind. And if you look at the way that this boat is pointed, it's pointing back towards us, towards land. And keep in mind that we don't know how to drive this boat yet. So we got in the boat and we looked at each other and we shook our heads and said, we have made a terrible mistake. And then everybody went away. And all we had was a couple of ropes tying the boat to the dock. We had the boat, we got it ready, followed down our checklist. Then we would press the starter, it didn't start. And then we pressed the starter again and it didn't start. And then I climbed around in the engine room, trying to look as manly and as competent as I could. And I would jiggle a wire as if that would make a difference, and it wouldn't start. And then I remembered something I read on the internet. And I said, And then that grunt was magic, right? So I started pushing this little button and it started spitting gas out. And the gas was bubbly, and then it was bubbly, and then it was clear. So I turned the what's it or who's it or whatever. And I said, try now, as men do, right? And she pushed the button and it started. And then we threw the ropes onto the boat so that now we were floating. And then I was smiling and I said, I pushed the throttle forward. And Maggie said, I turned around her, ready to bask in her glow. And she said, you're going to hit the dock. And then she said, you're going to hit the dock. No, really, you're going to hit the dock. If you don't turn right now, you're going to smash into the dock, right? So I did all that I knew how to do. And finally, I got the boat to respond. And then she turns around and I thought she was going to say, great job. But she said, you're going to hit the boat. You're going to hit the $10 million boat. You're going to hit the $10 million yacht. And I just managed to avoid it by probably a foot or two. And then we drove all the way out to the middle of the lake where we couldn't hit anything. And then we turned everything off and we looked at each other and we said, we have made a terrible mistake. But we got used to it. We learned a little bit about the boat. We eventually got it home and through the lock system that we'll talk about a little bit later. But I want to pause this story to talk about the greater question. Why am I at a programming conference talking about the Great Loop? Well, the loop is the hint. Loops are at the heart of programming, but I want to talk also about the human experience, right? Because we are people. It's people that actually write programs. And I don't want to lose sight of us. So I want to talk about the very first program that I ever wrote. It wasn't in Elixir, it was in BASIC. And it printed my name over and over and over again. I must have run that program and let it go for, I don't know, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I was just staring at the screen, just laughing, right? This magical thing printing Bruce over and over. Then I would add a couple of spaces and it would print Bruce at an angle, or subtract a couple of spaces and it would print Bruce at an angle. And I was hooked from that day moving forward. And later on in my career, I started to get interested in a different kind of loop. And actually, there are a bunch of people in the Elixir Kenya group that are also learning what an OTP looks like. We actually coded an OTP loop without OTP in the very last session that we started to work on. But here's how it works. We have this loop, and then we have these custom callbacks so that this idea is inversion of control. We basically let OTP do the looping and the process machinery, and our code picks up the responsibility of programming these tiny custom handlers. And what do? Well, they can do anything that we want them to do as long as they satisfy the interface. And in this instance, the interface is called a behavior. A behavior is a way of taking another piece of code that's in charge, in this case, the OTP loop, and calling custom behavior that we can then provide. So typically, if you find yourself passing modules around in an Elixir application, you're working with a behavior. So this OTP loop has a name. It's called a gen server. And the way that it works is that I take this behavior that knows how to do its process machinery, and at some point, somebody sends a message, and we get control. We get to write a small function. It's called a handler. And maybe it's called handle cast, which is one way, or handle call, which is two way. But in either case, the process is the same. What we're allowed to do is take some old state, feed it through our custom handler, and it creates some new state. This is a transformation, and we can use it to do little bits of work, one message at a time. That's OTP. Here's what it looks like in code. That yellow use gen server, that's what's going to eventually incorporate the behavior. That's a macro. And that macro is going to have behavior in it somewhere. And that yellow count, that's the state. And that count plus one is the transformation of the state. So I have my inversion of control, the contract, and the behavior. I have the old state and the transform state. And I package it up, and it turns into this recursive callback that I can use to write custom programs without writing any process machinery, because the magic of Elixir and a behavior. So let's talk a little bit about the loop. Sometimes, so it's not going to surprise you that rivers are not flat things, and that boats sometimes go great distances over rivers. So there must be some way for a boat to go down and up on the rivers as they're required. And in fact, there is such a thing. It's called a lock. And this is the very first, or actually the second lock that we ever did. And normally we're used to seeing tiny little other boats, like, I don't know, motorboats and pontoon boats. But this one had this big commercial tug. And the lockmaster told us by radio, hey, if you want to go through now, you can go through with this big commercial boat, or you can wait 4 hours and go through later. And we said, we'll go through now. Thank you very much. But so we pulled our boat into this chamber. They closed the doors. And then if they wanted to go up, they'd fill it up with water. And if we wanted to go down, they'd drain the chamber from water. But either way, we'd come out on the other side, nice and neat. And this is the neighbors. So you could see the Bearcat, which is the big toe behind, and one of our friends coming out of the lock. And you can see that black and white striped piece. That's where the doors usually are. That's right near the end of the door. Now, along the Great Loop, there are all kinds of crazy ways to manage this difference in geography. Sometimes you pull your boat into a rail car. Here we are pulling our boat onto a railway, and the whole thing picks you up and drives you over land and drops you back into water on the other side. This one is called the Big Chute, and it's in Canada. That's not the craziest one. This is the craziest one. This one is called the Peterborough Lift Lock. And that thing is full of water, and you float your boat into that thing, they close the doors, and then it just moves up and down like an elevator, and it is strangely exhilarating and obviously terrifying all at the same time. Now, it turns out that there was almost a disaster in this exact lock about 2 months after we were there. Actually, it was another lock like this one. This is the Peterborough lock. That one was the Kirkfield lock, right? But we just pulled our boat into there. They closed the doors. And if you look down beneath us, we're way in the sky. If this thing goes up, I don't know if it's 20 meters or 30 meters, but it is a tall It's a tall feature. So this is how that interface works. So if we didn't have such a lock, the interface would be a waterfall, right? So we would take we'd float currently up to the edge of the waterfall. It would go down the waterfall, and the story would have a sad ending. But instead, we have a lock. So we're going to replay this. The lock serves as our interface, and it allows me to build a transformation between the two levels of the water. The story does not have a sad ending because there's a lock. I can float it to the top of the lock. And all you need to think about when you think about a lock is a chamber with doors on either end. They close the doors and they drain out the water a little bit at a time. This is nothing but an interface. So it might not surprise you that we had to earn a living. So we basically planned to work on currently, and we were mostly successful. Of course, there are more tasks. We have to keep gas in the boat, but a lot of the work was the same things that I would do locally. Here I am writing on a book with some engine parts on the counter and a little bit of food. And it's funny, if you see those bananas, there was a particularly wavy day. The bananas were up on a hook, and every little wave that we hit shook currently a little bit. And slowly, bit by bit, half these bananas slowly peeled themselves so that they dropped these peeled bananas onto that table of currently. Here I am working on the Groxio site. Here I am working with Groxio content. And the thing that made it possible, you could see 3 white dishes, and the medium-sized one on the upper right, that's an antenna. And that goes down to this device called a PEP wave. And if you look closely at the bottom, you see cellular SIM1 and SIM2. So it takes a little chip just like the one that goes into your mobile phone, but it takes 2 of them. So we could have 2 providers like AT&T and Verizon. They're the 2 big ones on the Great Loop. And it will literally take the best signal that it can from each one and stitch it together to make a better signal so that we could get reliable internet even when either signal was not reliable. That was pretty cool. So I want to talk about metaphorical icebergs and tsunamis. Of course, we didn't see either one, but we were in situations that we want to take care of our safety. And I want to talk about how we handle things safely. Well, you've already seen one way, though you might not have realized it. The way to do concurrency and failover on a great loop is to travel with buddy boats. And most of the time, this works pretty well. But it turns out for our particular trip, we wound up crossing that great section of the ocean, of the Gulf of Mexico, all by ourselves. So we didn't have the benefit of a buddy boat. So what do? Now, the crossing is the part of the Great Loop that fills all loopers with fear. You see, most of us are not great boaters to start with. And most of us never drive our boats out of sight of land. But in the Great Loop, we have to do that 3 times. And the longest time, we're crossing the Gulf of Mexico, where there's more heat than usual, and that means that the weather can be more severe. So what do? Let me give you a sense of what our crossing was like. So we are looking for buoys that look like this one. In particular, we're looking for red 2 that is right at the end of, I think it's called Dogleg Island or Dog Island or something like that. And then we're going to go cut across the Gulf until we find red 4. And red 4 is like 2 points. So we find one, and then we point our boat at the other one on a map. And we don't touch the steering wheel for 22 hours. And we go across the Gulf. And if we picked our weather day correctly, then it's a happy crossing. If not, this is a marriage ender, right? It gets really rocky, and it's the waves are usually hitting you sideways. And so if you could think about rocking side to side for 20 hours, it's kind of a crazy deal. We crossed with a friend. His name was Sam. He's probably one of our better friends in Chattanooga, but he's someone that has seen us at our worst. He's seen us when we're angry and upset. He's seen us when we're happy. He's seen our house at the messiest. So it was okay inviting him along on a boat when crosswords were going to be said at some point. But we heard about crossings with big, giant waves. We didn't have that. But almost glass out there. And then in the middle of the night, we used these lights like this one. This is the other time that we were running at night. We were on the Tennessee River, but the light helps us preserve our night vision. And in the middle of the night, we had 2 things on the top of our mast to help us. One, this bright light that would tell other boats that were actually paying attention where we were. And the other thing is that white disc that you probably can't see very well, but that white disc is radar. So we could see other boats and we could see other obstacles sometimes. And so we had one thing go wrong during the whole crossing. That light went out. So I had to climb on top of the boat in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of the darkness, and change that bulb. But I did it, and it was all okay. So here's a picture of our GPS. It's really boring, right? Us in the middle of the ocean, but it wasn't boring at the time. And eventually we did make it safely to the other side. But I want to talk about some of the things that we did that allowed us to be safe. And these are also like some of the other systems that we have in software. We had a backup system. The backup system was our dinghy. It's a small little boat on the top. Here we are just after we added the dinghy to the top of the boat. Here's a friend that's a whitewater raft guide in Chattanooga, Tennessee. His name is Henley, and here he was testing our dinghy with us. We also filed a float plan. So this is like a disaster plan that you would have. So if you have a script that you follow when things go wrong, then you have the opportunity to kind of be safe, right? So in our case, we filed a float plan. This is one that you would send to the Coast Guard, but we filed our float plan. We told our friends where we were coming from, where we were going to, and when we expected to be there. And so that's the formal float plan that you would file with the United States Coast Guard if you were taking such a trip. And we also had means to communicate should something go wrong. And that was a radio, a VHF radio. And the international, or our national channel for distress was channel 16. So we left our boat on channel 16. We also had a logging system. And so Sigu in Chattanooga gave a talk on observability, but one of the features that you would like to be able to observe is your log system. You'd like to be able to see that in any instance. And we had our logging system where we would write down the hour, we would write down the latitude and longitude, so that if our electronic systems failed, we would be able to tell the Coast Guard where we were no more than an hour away, an hour ago. It's kind of like a supervisor, right? A supervisor is no more than a gen server, but it manages the life cycle for OTP. It knows how to start things and restart things. So that if there's a gen server, and if the gen server, if something happens to it, like the Coast Guard recognizes something happens to us, the Coast Guard can rescue us so that we can start again another day. And so in this way, we looped through swamps, next to military vessels. We're the little one. To Washington, D.C., or close by, where we met Frank Hunleth, the creative nerves, and his daughter. But one of the things that was cool was that even in shallow waters, those red and green buoys would keep us safe. You've seen this one. Sometimes they're bigger, sometimes they're smaller. This is a green one. And I want to talk about the reds and greens, not just in the physical sense, the ones on the river, but also the metaphorical reds and greens. Things like science and the rules of good civilization. The Great Loop community, we protected each other when the COVID was at its worst. We listened to the science, we did the things that we had to do. We wore masks around each other when it was appropriate to do so. And in this way, we stayed safe. Just like Elixir protocols and behaviors. Even when Elixir doesn't know what the eventual type will be, we have contracts. And if you follow the contract, like the behavior contract in a gen server, or like a contract or a list. So if you go into IEX and you type I space 123, that's the I function. I function is part of IEX helpers. This means information. So it'll give you something that looks like this. And if you look all the way at the bottom, you have this thing called a protocol. Because a list or even modules that don't exist right can have an implementation that tells Elixir how to represent something in string form for debugging. And that way, even though Jose didn't know anything about the strange and wonderful things that we're building, we can tell the system how to represent itself through a protocol. Or we have gen servers. Gen servers use behaviors. This use gen server basically announces our intention to consume the gen server API. And these are the functions that implement the callbacks, right? So impl true announces our intention to consume a callback. And when we were in Canada, we found out that we looked down at our chart plotter and we found that we were in a place where most of our friends told us not to go. If you look around, you see all these rocks. But it turns out that even in such places, the Canadians had things so well marked with red and green buoys that as long as we kept the reds on our right, the greens on our left, we stayed safe. So we looped through swamps, through New York City, even past the Statue of Liberty, and the seat of power in Canada, in Ottawa. where we worked our way up this slow staircase straight into the capital city with others looking on, across sunsets. And you see, programmers get the idea of a loop. Programmers understand that in a loop, you start somewhere. And with every iteration and every stop, they transform us. Sometimes in expected ways, and sometimes unexpected, like dolphins that came close enough to us to touch. Sometimes in isolation, sometimes concurrently. But we watch and we wait, sometimes for the weather to clear, until we come back home, transformed in exactly the right way. Thank you.
Was this worth your time? Hope so. Please subscribe to stay in the loop for more of this content. In case of any queries or suggestions, feel free to hit us up on Twitter. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to ElixirconfAfric 2024. And here's the best part about this one. It'll be an in-person event. What a good excuse to come to Kenya. Again, we're super grateful for helping make this a success and definitely looking forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers!